Okay, welcome and thanks to everyone for being here today for this talk. I'm Sarah Stevens, and I'm one of the organizers with Architects Against Housing Alienation. And I'm speaking to you today from the stolen lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in the place that is now known as Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. Very happy to get to introduce our speaker for today as part of the Superstudio to End Housing Alienations lecture series. We have Mauricio Soto Rubio, who is an associate professor at the University of Calgary's School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape, where he also directs the Building Construction Innovation Group. And for the Super Studio, he taught a studio last fall. And if you check out the website, superstudio.aha.ca, you can see some of the student work. And I imagine he will share more of it with us today. So, Mauricio, very grateful to have you here today. Please take it away. Oh, and I should say, I'm very sorry, but I'm not going to be able to stay for the whole lecture. So I will not get to join for the questions, but I'll catch up with what I missed later. Mauricio.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you guys hear me okay? Uh, my internet is sometimes not very reliable, but hopefully this will work. Can you guys hear me? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, thank you, Sarah, for for the introduction, and thank you both of you, and the rest of the team for organizing this event. I know how much work it goes into putting these things together, so I really appreciate it. As someone who's deeply committed to fighting for housing in this country. So I wanted to begin with, a couple of slides that I also used during my last presentation, but I think they're still very relevant. On the left, we see a 19th century painting, by Paul Kane, who's a renowned, Canadian artist, showing the Canadian prairies, buffalo, and the vast, let's say, ecosystems that once defined, this land. Um, on the right, by contrast, we see the Canadian, or like the contemporary suburban sprawl of the city of Calgary in 2025, right? So what that means is that essentially in just over years, we transform the system into a series of spreading houses that extend further and further into the horizon. Now, this is not uncommon in Canada. In fact, it's the dominant housing model in the country today. Essentially, endless, isolating, and energy inefficient, and increasingly expensive single-family homes, right? And they are essentially we carve our land that was at some point sustain a diverse life and ecosystem to achieve this. And of course, the question that I'm asking is, well, given all this effort, all this transformation of the land, what have we actually achieved? Because of course, here is the let's say here is the paradox that despite all of this massive transformation, so despite decades and decades of suburban expansion, highways, subdivisions, and endless construction, we are still in a housing crisis. So we consume the land, but we haven't really solved the housing problem. We transformed ecosystems, and we still haven't created homes that are affordable, adaptable, resilient, and culturally appropriate. And just some data, for reference, and I know many of you guys are already familiar with this, but these are local data from the city of Calgary. Essentially, last year we were 42,000 homes short um, to restore housing affordability. And about 20% of households in the city just cannot simply cannot afford suitable housing, affordable housing. Rents went up 40% last year, which is something that students have felt, personally. And the median home price of a home in Calgary is almost $600,000, and that's about, again, 6 times the average household income in the country. And we have almost 3,000 homeless people in the city of Calgary at any given time. So the message is essentially clear. We cannot simply build our way out of this crisis by repeating the same housing model, right? So the question is not a question of um, number of houses. We need to ask a different question, right? So what kind of housing can help us live more sustainably, more collectively, and more resiliently? Especially in this era that we live in now, which is certainly an era of uncertainty and instability, right? So what the porous dwelling asks the questions, what happens if housing wasn't static? What happens if the house was able to evolve with people and its demands, adapted to the climate, and maybe foster a more collective life, brought us together instead of separating us? So, um, and here is then maybe another perspective to consider, which is that for most of the 20th century, housing was designed around a fairly stable social model. We didn't live in this, highly volatile, uh, unstable social ecosystem. And architects assume that, let's say, a nuclear family lived together for a very long period of time. They wanted to live in a privately owned home or apartment, and all domestic life was organized clearly around determined spaces. Bedrooms for sleeping, let's say living rooms for gathering and socializing, kitchens for cooking, and the whole home was largely separated from work and public life. But of course, that's no longer the case. Um, if we think about what assumptions we can rely on today, households are becoming clearly more diverse. A lot more people are living alone, uh, share housing, sharing housing with unrelated adults, and they also move more frequently throughout their lives. I have personally lived in over 10 countries, and uh, who knows if I'm done, right? So at the same time, uh, work and domestic life are increasingly intertwined, especially with remote and hybrid working environments since COVID. There are also different economic pressures that are changing expectations of our housing. In all major Canadian cities, fully self-contained private housing is becoming less affordable. And there is a growing interest, and rightly so, in my opinion, in shared resources, right? Perhaps shared kitchens, shared working spaces, shared social spaces. So, what this means is that in many housing models, we inherited these models for housing from the 20th century, and we're struggling to accommodate contemporary lifestyles. So the question becomes, how can architecture respond to these changing patterns of living? Now, one possible direction is to rethink housing, again, not as a collection of isolated dwellings, but as a system of spaces, a system of living, right? And these spaces might allow a different degree of privacy, sharing, flexibility. So this is where the idea of porous dwelling, begins. So, fluid lives require adaptable housing. And so these are what I've been calling the porous dwelling for the last, couple of semesters. The idea that, dwelling should be open, adaptive, and resilient, mediating perhaps between inside and outside, between private and collective, between human and ecological. So of course, the porous dwelling is more than just a metaphor. is a framework for rethinking housing. So it begins again with adaptability. Housing should grow, shrink, transform with people's lives and their all individual requirements. They should probably use passive strategies, mediating heat and cold and working with the land rather than against it. Um, so it should also be resilient, responding to climate changes and ecological intelligence. The dwelling should also be evolving, not has a fixed product, um, but has a process of change. Homes should be able to adapt across generations. And finally, dwellings, should be collective, or at least um, support collective interaction. They should create opportunities for shared resources, cooperation, and community life. Because, at the end of the day, housing is not just about shelter, but it's about the relationships that the shelter makes possible. Now, of course, this is not something particularly new. We're all familiar with the Moriyama House, by Sana in Tokyo. And so this is a project that is already 20 years old or more. And this was a project that initially challenged, this preconceived assumption that a house must be a single enclosed object. And instead, this building, um, which contained all the proper domestic functions, was broken into multiple smaller volumes distributed across the entire site. Circulation, of course, happened in between these modules. It happened outdoors through shared courtyards, gardens. So moving from one room to the other would require passing through the spaces that are neither fully private, but also not fully public. And these in a way produced a kind of um, spatial porosity, a gradient between individual rooms, shared outdoor spaces, and of course the city as a whole. Now, it is, um, of course, this project was somewhat exceptional in the sense that it was a project. Uh, it's an expensive project done by, what Japanese called boutique architects. Um, so it's not necessarily something that I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a scalable housing model, but it still raised an interesting question. What happens when domestic life is not longer contained within the individual housing unit? What happened when domestic life could instead be distributed and dispersed across the landscape, um, and or across a variety of different spaces? And this was, of course, what the architect had in mind. This is just an original sketch, um, but it's also interesting to consider that um, one of the aspects of the Moriyama house, especially now, as it be, 20 years later, is that many activities happened in the spaces in between buildings. So corridors and circulation areas were not just spaces to move from one space to the next, but they became spaces for working, meeting, and spending time. In this image, for example, we can see one of the architects that worked for Santa, using the space between two rooms as working space, right? So the architecture allowed domestic activities to extend, let's say, beyond the interior of the spaces. And um, I, I, I don't know exactly to what degree all of this was considered by the architects, probably so, but I find it to be one of the most interesting aspects again of these projects, specifically because nowadays um, the project has evolved, right? So you can now individually rent any or like some of these specific rooms. So a variety of visitors and as well as people living more permanently in the project can actually interact informally. And residents and visitors, they they gather in the courtyards, for small events, barbecues, conversations, perhaps shared meals. And because all of this circulation happens outdoors, people can encounter each other much more frequently. So the architecture itself, the porosity of the architecture, encourages this spontaneous interaction, um, which I think is the spirit of the porous dwelling. Nowadays, is I have found, projects such pictures such as this, in which some of the outdoor spaces support more collective events. In this image, for example, there's a movie being projected into, let's say, one of the outdoor walls, one of the facades of the individual buildings, essentially transforming the outdoor courtyard into a small improvised outdoor cinema. Um, so, the architecture essentially again allows the spaces between buildings to function almost as a small neighborhood square, connected not only to the individual rooms of the individual buildings, but also to the rest of the city, which again I find quite fascinating. And this is the original plan, of course, of that building, which, like I said before, has evolved over time, right? So some of these smaller units can now be rented independently, and visitors, can stay there for short periods of time. And so again, the project is becoming a place where a lot of people pass through. You have the residents, you have perhaps guests, temporary visitors. Um, so and everything happens in the in-between spaces. Um, that's where strangers get to meet, interact, and briefly form a community. Now, of course, the question is, can this, let's say, sensitivity can it be applied on a larger scale? So, this is a project that you might also be familiar with, right? So this is the Spreefeld housing in Berlin, and by Carpaneto, Schönig, Architekten. Anyway, I'll let you. I don't have to read the whole thing, but architecture offices, and it's a project in Berlin. So if the Jana House, shown how domestic life can extend into these shared spaces within the individual single dwelling. Again, the question is whether that sensitivity, whether similar ideas can work at a large of the scale of the collective dwelling. So this is a cooperative housing project that was completed again in 2014 along the Spree River. And in this case, the project consists there are three individual multifamily buildings that are organized around a series of shared outdoor spaces. Now, what makes this project particularly meaningful is that it treats housing not just as a collection of apartments, a collection of, let's say, individual dwellings, but has social and special infrastructure. So the architects were deliberate into creating spaces between buildings, shared terraces. They lowered the scale of some facades to lower the to create more a sense of to make sure that the building was felt and experienced at the scale of the human. And they also included a series of collective facilities that supported interaction among the residents. So in this sense, Spreifeld explores the idea of porous dwelling at a scale of collective housing, where domestic life extends beyond the boundaries of the individual apartment. And so this is a diagram that talks a little bit more about that. So we can see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but we can see here, it says, this is a power station and with a winter garden. And we have, so this is the all exterior program. So you can see Private is essentially, vertical gardens that go inside, the individual units. But we have roof garden, option space, courtyards. There's a beach with about a boathouse, and of course the public path. And this is also the project was also the result of a cooperative approach. So essentially, the site was never really up for sale. It didn't have so it wasn't really something that commercial real estate developers could really access. And so it was actually tackled by Baugruppe, so a collective, uh, a group of a non-profit group that put together both, the residents and the designers, um, and they were able to actually capture this place. So, of course, the building is also doing a lot more. So this is the structure we can see here, the roof garden, and all the different typologies in terms of, from windows to bathrooms and so on. Also, what I find really interesting is that we can see here three buildings that were designed by three distinct architects or three architecture offices, and yet the three projects were responded to one another in a really holistic way. So I think that the idea of the white man from a privileged background um, and a large ego that becomes the master architects and tells the world how things should be is behind us. The New York Five and all of these people who were responsible for most of the work of last century in architecture is being replaced by a younger generation of architects that can actually work collaboratively and respond not to their own individual sensitivities, but to the needs of society at large, which I think is a healthier place to be. So, um, again, instead of concentrating all the activities inside private apartments, the architects decided to introduce a range of shared outdoor functions and gathering spaces. And then here in this um, in this slide we can see also a lot of shared infrastructures, right? So of course the vertical circulation core, but also communal terraces, um, vertical gardens and so on. So the elements function as a kind of collective domestic infrastructure, right? So instead of, again, every apartment containing all possible facilities internally, service spaces, right, are distributed across the building and shared among all residents. So this approach essentially reduces redundancy and encourages community and interaction among all the neighbors. Um, Here we can see all the interior program, right? So we see the standard flats or standard apartments. So everything that's red is the typical, one, two, and three bedrooms apartments. But everything that is the cluster units is all the yellow. And these are essentially, almost like modular um, dwellings that you can um, own or rent according to need. So you might decide to have one or two or three bedrooms and share a communal kitchen, share other infrastructure. And finally, you also have option space, which I think is one of the most interesting aspects of this project, in which essentially, those might be bedrooms, those might be, or like, let's say, guest bedrooms, or those might be additional storage um, spaces that you can on a temporary basis according to need. So those don't belong to anybody, but you have access to them. And of course, they also have a lot of communal spaces and commercial units attached to the complex, allowing for that for people to live and work in the same building. So this is the working areas, with workshops, youth club, laundry, communal rooms, and so on. And again, the optional space are the yellow that you can also rent. And that also is deployed again within the cluster units. This is what I was saying. You have this is all communal spaces, all that is yellow, right? So you have a communal kitchen, you have a communal living room, of course, outdoors terrace and circulation. But then, it's essentially more individual bedrooms and bathrooms, and you can rent one or two or different depending on need and the availability of resources. So the single units might have, a mini kitchen, a bathroom, a bed, and a little private terrace on the outside, and shared all the yellow communal spaces, including living room, kitchen, bathroom, and communal terraces. So a different approach. Now, of course, the facades have been designed to maintain privacy, right? So balconies, vertical gardens act as intermediate spaces between, let's say, the private apartment and the shared outdoor environment. And these thresholds create a gradient of privacy, allowing residents to, let's say, engage with the community at large and still maintain their own personal space. So how can architecture then create these gradients between private and collective space in these new housing typologies? This is of course, all the in-between buildings, right? So shared courtyards, community facilities, there's a kindergarten. So these spaces really support everyday life. Children are playing, neighbors are meeting, residents get together informally. So the project maintains a connection with the surroundings and with the riverfront, right? Rather than becoming an isolated residential enclave, parts of the site really remain open and accessible to the broader community. So just like, the Moriyama House, many of the most important activities occur in the spaces in between buildings. Of course, that's not to say that the interior spaces have been um, forgotten, right? So they are, of course, private apartments. The private apartments remain important spaces for personal life. So the project tries to balance individual privacy with this collective infrastructure and introduces interesting concepts. Like I said, these option rooms, additional rooms located between apartments that residents can rent temporarily when they need more space. Um, so yeah, so in this way, this project reorganizes domestic infrastructure, and certain functions that traditionally belong inside the private living unit become collective resources for the entire building. And in a way, this project, demonstrates that this idea of porosity in housing is not just only about form and space, but it can be about social, pragmatic activities and also time, allowing housing to adapt to changing ways of living, to changing needs, and so on. Um, Now, I wanted to also talk about maybe a second project, this time a more recent project, and this is a project that my students actually brought to my attention, um, which is the modulus matrix housing project. So in this case, um, the this is a project that by Peris and Toral Arquitectes, and this is just outside Barcelona, right? So in Cornellà de Llobregat. And the idea behind this project is that the project is a structural system that, instead of designing a fixed apartment layout, the architects developed a singular structural grid, right? It's a matrix of identical special modules, and every module is about 3.6 meters times 3.6 meters. It's all CLT, and each module, in a way, can function obviously as a room if closed up, but the housing units are essentially simply combinations of these forms. So because the structure doesn't really prescribe a specific apartment layout or configuration, basically the units can be organized in many different ways depending on the needs of the resident. So the building acts less as a collection of apartments and more as a special framework that can accommodate. So this is an example of how um, structure itself can also enable the structure in a building can also enable flexibility. So here we see a plan of the project, right? So the plan essentially showcases how the system works. So we have a certain number of fixed elements, such as the bathrooms, which are here, right? And you have inside the all the infrastructure necessary for them, right? So kitchens and also, bathroom on the other side, bathroom, kitchen, bathroom. So, and of course, all the vertical circulation. So they are vertical circulation cores that also are fixed, but everything else is up for grabs. So essentially, um, everything else can be arranged freely um, within this matrix. So this allows the housing unit to potentially expand, contract, or change configuration in the over time as households need to evolve, or perhaps financial resources change. So the double facade, we saw the initial views of the building. The double facade, the circulation also plays an important role. So this external circulation, there are galleries, like the picture on the right, that act as share spaces that connect apartments while still functioning as climatic buffers, right? So this is in Spain, um, just outside Barcelona, so it can be really hot, especially in the summer. So this double facade system is a place where uh, um, people can move and they can decide depending on whether or not this wall is here, whether or how often you could visit your neighbor. And I've been told that children of the current residents visit each other through these facade spaces. Um, so yeah, so again, they're more than just simply corridors. They function as semi-public spaces where the residents can encounter each other, maybe pause, or use the space informally for whatever they want. So similar to the in-between spaces of the Moriyama house or the shared, let's say, terraces of the Spreefeld building in Berlin, these circulation areas become important social spaces within the building where neighbors can talk about and talk and meet and socialize. And again, they also provide these environmental benefits by shading the apartments and still allowing ventilation and natural light to come in. And so these are some of the interior views. And of course, the rooms are left intentionally neutral and flexible. So essentially, if you decide that that room is no longer where you need, you could close this threshold here. And the structural grid does not prescribe any specific, configuration or function. The spaces can simply adapt to whatever the inhabitants want. Well, so is this a living space? Is this a sleeping space? Is this a working space? Is it a gathering space? And this flexibility essentially acknowledges that domestic life is constantly changing, right? Rather than designing a house for a single ideal household that no longer exists, this project really provides this special system, a special system that is capable of multiple forms of living over time. for a variety of different people. So the project, in a sense, is demonstrating another dimension of what we call the porous dwelling. The architecture should remain open to transformation. Now, the final project that I wanted to show is another project in Spain, in Barcelona, it's called the La Borda Cooperative Housing by La Col from 2018. Now, this project um, is also a cooperative housing project, and it was developed. Um, it shared many of the characteristics that we have discussed already. Interesting thing about this project, in addition to everything else, is that it was by residents themselves, or it was a resident-led process that, of course, included the architects, but it was led by the people themselves. So the project really explores how collective governance, right, collective financing, and shared domestic um, infrastructure can really reshape our understanding of housing. So this is the main facade, and you can see again, we're not talking about a fancy building. It's not necessarily designed to make the cover of glossy magazines. It's just like really polycarbonate, sheathing and reinforced concrete. There's nothing particularly fancy, but they do use CLT inside um, to facilitate um, flexibility. So one of the most important spaces of this building is again the shared common space on the first floor that we can see here, right? So this is a space that has a lot of shared infrastructure. So you have here, some of the laundry, gathering space, maybe, toys for the kids and so on. And right now the picture is taken with the community meeting. So instead of placing a lot of functions inside every single apartment, the building essentially provided collective facilities, such as, again, the laundry spaces, meeting areas, and gathering rooms. And the residents decided it was a conscious effort and a conscious trade back, that they chose this instead of having larger apartments. So these shared spaces become part of the everyday life of 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 the place, is where domestic life is deployed, at least partially. Now, this is now a diagram, an axonometric drawing that shows how the building is really organized around this central courtyard, right? So it's a central courtyard covered with polycarbonate, and there are circulation galleries all the way around. And then, this is the vertical circulation core, and this is the first floor common space with there is even like a little amphitheater. So, right, so the project again includes the shared spaces on the ground floor, and of course the residential units are above, and of course collective terraces on the roof. So the architects intentionally created a sequence of spaces between private apartments and the shared community areas. Uh, this is a picture of the prefabricated vertical circulation core in cross-laminated timber, which I absolutely love. And then this is a picture of the courtyard, the commons area, right? And then these are the housing units and the terrace above, all the way on, and the corridors going around. Um, so is is um, Yeah, so as we saw earlier, essentially, the construction system selected also supported this innovative housing model, which I think is fascinating. Now here we see a typical plan, right? And we can see that, all right, so you enter here and you have a two-bedroom apartment, right? So you enter here and you have this little living room, closet, you have kitchen, bath, you have a little dining, and then you have one bedroom here, access to terrace, and then you have one bedroom. And then, by the way, you also have these um, additional guest spaces or guest bedrooms that you can also rent. So this is one of such bedrooms for potential visitors, and then this will be then another one bedroom apartment, and uh, the ones on this side, on the right-hand side, then they become more as housing units, so like smaller housing units. So in this case, we can see we enter here, we have one bedroom, one closet, and then we have living, bathroom, kitchen, and so on. So there is, and they also have shared resources. So these individual um, of course, housing units have, of course, access to the shared resources in other floors and so on. So, of course, that's not compromise necessarily the quality of the interior spaces, right? So these are small apartments, but the quality of the space is also based on the light, the expression of materials. So these living units are comfortable, cozy, and convenient, and so it's not, so that is something that speaks towards how affordable housing doesn't necessarily mean cheap housing. So affordable housing is just non-market housing that has been developed according to a different and alternative and more humane set of priorities, but it's not necessarily just make things as small and cheap as possible. So, and this is just a picture again of how the design and funding process is part of this porosity that we're discussing. So there were workshops and meetings, and the residents participated in the decisions about their shared spaces, the organization of the building, and even the individual housing units, right? So this cooperative development process really, guaranteed that the architecture reflected the needs of the community, not just some random generic 20th century set of values, right? So here we can see the actual residents of the building getting together and interacting with the architect who brought this model and saying, okay, so how do we subdivide the space and so on. Porous housing, the governance becomes part of the architectural design, right? So something that I love also is that the circulation spaces around the courtyard, the roof terrace, the amphitheater and the central courtyard are intentionally generous, right? So rather than just functioning as narrow corridors, um, just for circulation, they become social spaces where residents like to meet, talk, draw their, put some laundry, to dry, time together. So these galleries create again a gradient between private apartments and the collective life. And even the back, so this is a picture of the main entrance. You can see it's not necessarily an like a very fancy, expensive building. It's just the substructure is just essentially reinforced concrete and CMUs. Um, but it reflects everyday life, right? Everyday life is visible at the entrance and also on the back facade with these corridors where, residents, put their bicycles, they put plants, these share outdoor spaces essentially reinforce the sense that this building is alive and functions as a small community rather than just a simple collection of private apartments. Okay, so coming to the end here. So, if we step back and look at these projects together, we can in a way see that this idea of porosity in housing operates across multiple scales, right? So in the Morijama house, porosity really emerged within the housing unit itself. Now, in the In the modular housing, in the modulus matrix housing, porosity is then embedded in the structural system of the building. So there is really no design, specific design of what a house should or should not be. You can rent one unit, or one of these modules, or you can rent the entire floor. Um, and it's the flexibility is embedded in the system, in the tectonics of the building. In the Spreefeld housing project, porosity also operates again at the scale of the multifamily building, at the scale of the community through shared domestic infrastructure. So the units are small, right? But they are carefully crafted um, to maximize the value of all the other shared resources around it, both inside and outside. And then in the final project in La Borda, that extends even further into governance, financing, and then collective ownership. So this idea that not everybody needs to own, a land motor, not everybody needs to own, have an extra guest room that is used twice a year, but that we can all benefit from the community around us. So, finally, I want to talk about the layers then of porous dwelling, right? So here, what these all of these projects show is that porosity in housing is not just about form. It is not just about space. Essentially, it operates at many different layers. Architecture can create, porous spaces between rooms, buildings, and the city. But it can also reorganize domestic infrastructure so that some functions are shared and not necessarily always duplicated. Um, we can think about structural systems that are embedded in the DNA of the project that allow housing to adapt, over time. Um, Understanding that we might not have the right solution now for what the future might bring. So having a project that can remain open-ended, in which the visitors can still grow and adapt. Sorry, the inhabitants can still grow and adapt to whatever the future brings. And it can even then also evolve new forms of collective ownership, financing, governance. Um, that also showcases that even though architecture is intrinsic to the question of um, housing in the future. In other words, this is a question, it's an issue that cannot really be solved without architects. We also understand that we alone cannot possibly imagine um, the solution that is larger than our profession. It needs to include essentially the society at large. So just to finalize, I want to say that, it's if housing is going to respond to changing lifestyles, to the environmental pressures of today, to the economic realities of today and the future, we might need to we might have to rethink housing as a porous system rather than just, a series of isolated, predetermined, private uh, housing options. And that's all I have.
Thanks so much, Maurizio. That was incredible. Such a wonderful theorization that I think the students of ours that are here, I think, are going to take that away and think hard about how architecture can be porous. It's a really beautiful idea that you're um, explained, I think, in a lot of detail with some beautiful examples. Are there any questions here or online? Maurizio, our students are feeling the burden of the term a little bit here.
Oh, yes.
So they're
I,
like, a
I relate.
little, they're like 50, well, I was going to say 50% here, both metaphorically and physically. Okay, question. Either you could come up if you're speedy. Well, we have a question here for you. They're going to come to the mic.
Okay. Hello, thank you so much for the lecture. I was wondering, based off of the precedents that you were showing us, much of them seem to be in very nice climates. And I really love this idea of extending the indoor kind of like private unit outwards to the outside and using that as a kind of social space. Especially coming from Calgary yourself, could you speak to maybe how those spaces tend to be inhabited in more colder regions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And of course, I totally recognize that, that these the designs are not necessarily, something that you can um, deploy, one to one in a place such as Canada, right? So there are other realities in our country that might, predetermine what's possible or what's not possible. Now, having said that, like there are like two ideas come to mind. So, for example, our students are now designing a multifamily building in the town of Canmore in up in the Rocky Mountains. So it's as cold, if not colder, than the city of Calgary. So now that said, it's interesting to also think that many of the people who choose living in a place like that, which is, by the way, very, very expensive, comparable to Vancouver in terms of housing, um, and yet 25% of all homes in the town are empty because they're owned by millionaires who come to the city to the town once a year. But the people who actually live in the place, they live in that town, they live there because they love being outdoors, right? So of course, it might not be suitable for everybody, but I will argue that, there's something intrinsically beautiful about just being outside. Now, that might not be, there might be occasions, throughout the year where that might not be possible because the temperatures are just too low. And of course, there might be, uh, people who that's just not an option. But even here at the University of Calgary, um, within the the psychology building, they built a little greenhouse space. And when it's minus 40 outside, there are a lot of students who just simply want to go to a larger, place filled with tropical plants and so on, and they just go there and enjoy. They get together and they socialize, they study in a place that might not be completely outside because obviously is a greenhouse, but it uses sustainable means to maintain its climate and allow people to enjoy some time uh, in that space. So I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I do think that the sensitivity is still valid, right? So this idea that all right, so what does that mean in terms of uh, blurring the boundaries between inside and outside, between private and public, between shared spaces and individual spaces. Um, and even in some of those examples that I showed in two of the three examples that I showed today, people, I found it really interesting that people walk in between the two elements of a double facade. So they're not necessarily outdoors, but they have plants there, and that's supposed to be, just infrastructural space that is uh, they find ways to capture it and bring it in a meaningful way, um, you know, in a way that contributes something to the community living in the building.
Thanks, Mauricio. Okay, we do have another question here, and no questions online yet. Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Grace.
Hello, hello.
Thank you so much for your talk. One of the things I really liked that you talked about in one of your projects is having a lot of not empty space, but space that could be used in different ways, or almost leaving it as like a blank slate so that the person who lives inside it can sort of customize it in their own way. One of my questions was, what is your general rule of thumb in terms of like these sort of like living spaces, and how large do you think certain areas should be, and how do we give enough space so that they can do whatever they want, but also not too much that they get overwhelmed or it feels like a lot of wasted space?
Right. Sure. So I think first of all, I would like to say that, like in the last project, right? So, the architects themselves realized, well, we might not have all the answers. So I don't think necessarily that this is, like a recipe that you should say, well, 20% of these should go here and 30% should go there. I think that will be difficult, especially moving into an uncertain future where we don't know what the priorities 10, 20, 30 years from now might be, or so on, right? So the structure, the family structures, everything is evolving and changing. So I think, maybe another way to look at this will be to say, well, first of all, every project might be different, right? So you might be, after you graduate, you might be in a position in which you say, well, I'm designing for this particular community, so we really need to get them involved, right? And what do they really want? What are they willing to do? So it might not be the same project to project. I think also it depends very much on what, not just, let's say, in terms of the area, but also in terms of what shared resources or what social spaces might be prioritized by the community. So some people might say, we really, laundry is fine, and sure we should have a social space, but we don't need anything else. Or someone might say, no, we really need more community kitchens, or these optional guest rooms, or maybe more storage, or whatever it might be. I think it's important also, again, to understand that the buildings, and the inhabitants of the building might also change in the future. So, what is valid now might not be valid later. So how do we incorporate a certain degree of flexibility in the system? Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a hard question, right? So I don't think it's as simple as saying, okay, so in terms of percentage or like square footage or something like that, it's more about what kind of lifestyle and domestic activities, like what new modes of domesticity, right, that the future might bring, and how we can creatively respond to that.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Mauricio, thank you so much. That was such a generous and wonderful lecture.
My
Um,
pleasure.
this was the second last of the Superstudio lecture series for this term. The last lecture will be by Robert Rayner from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern time on the next Thursday. So thanks again, Mauricio.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Well, thank you all. And yeah, I look forward to it,
Awesome.
to next Thursday. All right. Bye now.